Hello and welcome to the lunchtime lecture for March. And here we have the young and very exciting science communicator, Joshua Stiles. A little bit about him. Joshua is a very driven botanist and keen science communicator. He graduated from Edge Hill in ecology in 2017 and has since then done great things in his career as a top botanist and conservationist. And you might have seen him recently on TV and radio. Was it radio? What was it? BBC Four, Joshua?
It was, yeah.
It was. Okay. Joshua completed his degree after discovering a passion for plant conservation while volunteering for Cheshire Wildlife Trust, Lancashire Wildlife Trust, and others. His efforts to halt the decline and extinction of rare plants is recognized and has been supported by several organizations such as Justice Zoo, Natural England, and the BSPI. And I don't think I need to say anything more, but over to you, Joshua.
Thanks, Padma. Hello. So yes, I'm Joshua Stiles. I'm a botanist, and today I have very kindly been invited to give a talk specifically about a conservation program, a botanical conservation program that I run called the Northwest Rare Plants Initiative, which is a conservation program specific to Northwest England and supported by the likes of Chester Zoo, Lancashire Wildlife Trust, and the Wildflower Society. And so what was the rationale to begin a conservation program? Well, the rationale is pretty simple, and that is to address and reverse the declines and extinctions of rare plants, targeted rare plant species in the northwest of England. And just to give a few examples of how severe some of those declines have been over the past century. Sorry to start on a bit of bad news, but here's a few examples of how severe some plant declines have been in the past 100 years for target species. So for things like great sundew, a gorgeous carnivorous plant once called the English sundew. So in northwest England, great sundew in area has declined by over 85%. For plants like lesser bladderwort, looks like a bit of pond sludge, but actually it's amazing. One of the fastest plants in the world, and it's also carnivorous. Lesser bladderwort has declined by over 80% in the northwest. And for things like marsh gentian, which was on the cover of this PowerPoint, gorgeous plant with a huge blue flower. Marsh gentians declined in area occupancy in northwest England by over 95%. In 2018, a single flowering plant was found across the whole of the northwest. It's pretty diabolical, some of the declines in our rare plants, at least in northwest. And of course, these declines in plants are often mirrored, not just throughout the UK, but throughout the world. A recent 2020 Q report found that about 2 in 5 of the world's plant species are at risk of extinction. Okay, so what I did with the Northwest Rare Plants Initiative conservation program is I initiated it in August 2017, which is about a month after I graduated from university, in order to tackle recent major regional declines in targeted plant species. Soon after that, about a month later, I was very lucky to have obtained funding support from Chester Zoo, and later on, a bit later on, from Lancashire Wildlife Trust and the Wildflower Society, brilliant organisations. And although I might look young, I have got over 18 years, believe it or not, experience in botanical recording and horticulture. So I am very familiar with my wild plants, and yes, so there's a bit of history. And so we've talked about the rationale to begin this conservation program. So what what are the aims? Well, there's one overarching aim, and that is to establish ex situ populations of 43 threatened plants with the ultimate goal of both reintroduction into the wild and reinforcement, so reinforcing vulnerable populations where appropriate. Species selection, so out of those 43 target species, they were selected, and that selection, that choice was informed by a number of things like rare plant registers and lists, relevant county floras, distributional data, liaison with the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, the BSBI, and things like the English Red List. To a lesser extent, target species selection, of course, I'm growing these things, ex situ conservation, and so species selection, to a lesser extent, was also informed by ease of cultivation. Things like bog orchid, for example, might be very difficult to bring into cultivation, and so that might be a reason why I've excluded things like bog orchid, just as an example. One criticism that plant reintroduction sometimes face from particularly elderly botanists, apologies if you are an elderly botanist, but one criticism that some botanical reintroductions seem to have that is not really applicable to animal reintroductions is they are likened to gardening. Well, my response to that is it absolutely is not. The Northwest Rare Plants Initiative in particular, so this is a programme that accords with international and national guidelines on reintroduction and translocation, so moving species about. In particular, IUCN and JNCC guidelines, and also just added on to that, I also adhere to things like the BSBI Code of Conduct. So when I'm sampling plants from the wild, as well as obtaining all the relevant consents, assessing feasibility, I make sure that I only sample 1 in 20 plants if I need to pick things at all, to make sure that there are no impacts to vulnerable species populations. There's also a very careful selection of receptor sites. Those are questions need to be asked. Is a receptor site within the former range of a target species? Are factors that led to that specific species extinction no longer applicable? And is a proposed sort of receptor site suitably managed? Loads of questions need to be asked to assess whether a prospective reintroduction of a threatened plant species is appropriate, and also to assess for suitability. Also, as part of assessing suitability of various sites, it's a very detailed process. It's not just a case of whacking one plant from one place to another. So I actually use NVC, National Vegetation Classification Survey data, to determine specific communities of plants that exist on receptor sites. If anyone doesn't know what NVC is, it's basically a way to classify particular plant communities that exist on a given site, and so I use that data to inform suitability assessment. I hope that made sense. And if anyone is interested, I actually do have a reintroduction protocol on my website, so I can give everyone a second to write that down. I can also put it in the chat after this lecture, after this talk, if anyone wants. So yes, I do have a reintroduction protocol and a load more information on my website if anyone wants. Okay, so talked about rationale, aims, methods, protocol. Let's have a look at what has actually been done. So of the target, oopsie daisy, of those 43 target species, a total of 20, about half of those species in the past 3 years have been re-established to various sites. Of those, about half are associated with lowland raised bogs, which are a really, really special habitat. Of course, peatlands are some of our best, well, they are our best terrestrial carbon sinks. Although they cover about 3% of the planet's surface, they hold more than twice the amount of carbon when compared to all of the world's forests combined. Peatlands, really special habitat. But in lowland England, sadly, we've lost over 94% of them. And so a lot of the reintroduction work I've been involved in has been associated with plants that grow on peatlands, lowland peatlands. Things like bog asphodel, gorgeous plant. It was once called the Lancashire lily, although sadly it's practically died out in lowland Lancashire now, because of peatland loss and degradation. Things like lesser bladderwort that were extinct in Lancashire for about 150 years before 2018. Things like whitebeak sedge, one of the most gorgeous members of the sedge family. I think it's divine. The great sundew that I mentioned earlier, a lovely carnivorous plant that excretes a digestive mucus that kills animals, much better than a rubbish old tiger or a lion. And things like bog rosemary. These are all things that you might expect to find on a healthy lowland raised bog. But of course, these species have mostly or totally disappeared from a lot of the bogs in northwest England because of historical habitat loss and degradation. However, it's not all bad news. A lot is being done on the fragments of lowland raised bog that we have left. And that's not just in northwest England, that's throughout other parts of Britain and Ireland. A lot of these sites have come under the ownership or management of conservation organisations, and they're doing things like re-wetting these bogs. And that's great that they're beginning to restore these heavily degraded and abused habitats. And that's great because it means that the habitat is recovering. Things like this gorgeous little plant, Sphagnum papillosum, so sphagnum mosses are able to recover. However, there's one big problem when it comes to the restoration of peat bogs, and that is, as soon as all of these species are lost, there is often not a site nearby where they can possibly recolonize. And so what tends to be the case is once these gorgeous habitats, these gorgeous lowland peat bogs, and once they're degraded and these species are lost, they can't recolonize. And I'll just give one example of sort of just to demonstrate my point a bit more. So over here in this red circle, we've got what used to be one of the biggest and best raised bogs in the northwest, a big raised bog called Chat Moss. And Chat Moss was all but destroyed in the 1800s. Of course, it's right by big old industrial Manchester. And sadly, lesser bladderwort, that gorgeous aquatic carnivorous species, went extinct around the 1850s. And so what we were left with around Lancashire up here and Cheshire down here was a single population. And that's here in the green circle. And this single population is surrounded by forestry and it grows in what is essentially a puddle. And so what we need to ask ourselves is, when we restore what's left of Chat Moss up here around Greater Manchester, is it likely that lesser bladderwort will move all the way from Cheshire and recolonise these restored or improving sites? And the answer to that is obviously no, it probably will not recolonize. And in fact, it's more likely that this last site left that's surrounded by forestry in a little puddle will go extinct before it disperses itself to these sites. And so in the instance of lesser bladderwort, taking, having some kind of intervention to aid dispersal, it is and has been really beneficial. So here it is, the bit of pond sludge that I've talked about. I think it's a gorgeous plant, one of the fastest plants in the world. Bladderworts have these gorgeous bladder-like traps, and they are able to catch things like water fleas, mosquito larvae, and they do that within 1/10,000th of a second. And not only that, a single plant of bladderwort is able to consume tens of thousands of animals in a single growing season, which again is much better than a rubbish Bengal tiger or whatever else that you might think of. I think it's fantastic. And so what I did with lesser bladderwort in Northwest was, it took me a long time, but I worked very closely with Cheshire Wildlife Trust and Natural England, and I obtained consent to sample a very small number of plants from that final little puddle in Cheshire, the final population. I brought it into cultivation. In August 2018, I got consent. Again, working really closely with conservation organisations and Natural England, I got consent to reintroduce. And again, this does follow a really rigorous suitability assessment and everything else. So yes, August 2018, the plant was reintroduced, and here it is. It looks pretty naff, to be honest, but by October, all of those gorgeous little strands had grown by over 150-odd%. They were growing, they were establishing amongst this marginal sphagnum moss. It's a really interesting species of sphagnum. It's called dead cat moss, or drowned cat moss, because if you pull it out of the water or the pools in which it grows, it's meant to look like a drowned cat, sodden animal fur. Really weird. But anyway, so yes, from a total of 60 plants that were reintroduced back to Greater Manchester during 2018, they looked a bit like this. In 2019, it was over 29,000 plants, believe it or not, which was gobsmacking. It was amazing. And through surveillance monitoring in 2020 again, there are now there's over an estimated 200,000 individual plants across Greater Manchester, and this follows extinction over 150 years ago. And this is it. I think it's a super interesting plant, and an important part of these open water bodies on healthy lowland raised bogs. And so hopefully through this one single example, people can start to appreciate now, if you didn't before, how plant reintroductions can not only benefit individual species, but they can actually also go some way to helping sites recover from degradation. And yes, so with lesser bladderwort, I'm hoping for similar results next year at Black Lake and Lindo Common and a few other sites as well. On to another example, the gorgeous white sedge, which it is one of the prettiest members of the Cyperaceae, the sedge family. And it's also one of the named food plants for a very rare little butterfly called a large heath. And whitebeak sedge should be one of the most abundant components, one of the most frequent components of a healthy raised bog, where it grows in bog pools and hollows. However, again, just like the lesser bladderwort, it was wiped out from chat moss in the 1850s, over 150 years ago. So what I did, in similarity with the lesser bladderwort, I got permission to sample plants, and a trial translocation was undergone to a couple of sites, part of the Greater Manchester mosses, in 2018 to 2019. By May 2019, all of those little tiny plants had increased in size quite a bit. There was a large number of fruits being produced by these plants, and there was also a large number of seedlings. From those teeny tiny sods, those teeny tiny clumps that were moved onto the Greater Manchester mosses, these plants now cover an extensive area, which is absolutely fantastic. And it goes to show, again, the value of well-planned plant translocations. The populations across Greater Manchester are growing significantly every year. The population size has increased by well over 600%. And this is one big patch at Risley Moss. And so, yes, there's another fabulous example of an apparently successful reintroduction. There are a few other sites outside of those Greater Manchester mosses that this gorgeous plant has been reintroduced to, places like Danes Moss, where there's over 1,000 plants on the reserve now, big patches that are expanding out from those original little plugs that were planted. Lastly, very last example is the gorgeous, the divine great sundew, this carnivorous plant. It's a really sad story with the great sundew, because another common name for this plant is the English sundew, but now sadly there's about 20 places in England where you can see it. It was formerly a lot more widespread, but it's been lost from most of its English sites. In England, it's also red list endangered. Really sad story. And again, it's a plant that's typically, certainly in northwest England anyway, associated with these healthy lowland raised bogs, most of which have been degraded. So what I did here again is I was able to sample a number of plants from some of the last populations left with permissions in place, and I was able to reintroduce 10 plants originally in 2019, and in 2020 there was a fourfold increase. From those 10 plants there were 43 quite big juvenile healthy plants, and that was in midsummer. Not the best picture here, but that's what they look like in their little cages. I didn't go on from there. Yes, with great sundew, so there's now over 70 plants on the Greater Manchester mosses following reinforcement, and hopefully this plant will do well after its extinction there over 150 years ago. Just as a few updates as well, so we've got about half of those target species re-established, and overall there's been over 50 reintroduction programs rolled out since 2017. I think I've got ADHD, I can't keep still. And of those, about 13%, although it is still early days, about 13% have shown substantiated declines, or they've gone extinct after their reintroduction. About 31% have shown substantiated increases, or they are now considered established, well established, like the lesser bladderwort. And then the remaining 56% are either recent reintroductions, or there's been no quantifiable change in area coverage or population size. And also, lastly, as a bit of exciting news, there have been proposals submitted for the re-establishment of additional target species, things like marsh lousewort, which is a semi-parasitic plant. And I've just submitted my proposals to reintroduce that to Wimbury Moss National Nature Reserve this year. And there's also things like Dyer's greenweed, a gorgeous plant of old, unimproved grassland. There have been some lessons learned along the way. And the first really important lesson to learn with any reintroduction, not just of plants, but of animals too, is even following detailed suitability, feasibility assessments, even going through and making as much effort as you possibly can to reintroduce species correctly and in a way that maximizes success. Translocations or reintroductions can and do fail. It's important not to rely on reintroductions to mitigate impacts on important plants. However, multiple site selection, choosing multiple sites, I suppose it's only common sense, limits potential for failure. There's been a fantastic example of where plant reintroductions or plant translocations, moving plants from one place to another, has actually saved species from nationwide extinction, really. A great example might be a plant called brown bogrush, which was thought in the 1950s to only grow by one place in Scotland, a site called Loch Tummel. And so botanists rallied around this population because Loch Tummel was dammed. And sadly, that would have meant that this population would have been drowned and it would have gone extinct. And so botanists rallied and dug up as many plants as they could. And they replanted it in an area they thought would be unaffected by damming of Loch Tummel. And sadly, it died out, it got drowned. But they chose another site in a different area, and that population survived. And so that is a really, really important example of where moving plants from one place to another, although it's not ideal, it can benefit species. And there's another example called sharp clubrush. There's one site left in Britain, right near my house, actually. And a housing application went over it in the 1980s, and it would have destroyed that last remaining population left for Britain. Botanists again rallied round and moved it to a different place on the coast where it still persists and the population is growing. So there again, translocations can have positive impacts to species and biodiversity. So yes, there's a few bits and bobs about the Northwest Rare Plants Initiative, the aims, objectives, methods. We've talked a little bit about protocol and examples and even some lessons learned. So thank you very much, everyone, is what I will say. And I'd also like to say thank you very much to the Linnean Society for inviting me. It's been a privilege and a pleasure. So yes, if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Thank you so much, Joshua. That was really incredible, a great overview. And thank you for those photos. Very rarely would I be down in my knees in a peat looking at those plants. So thanks for this. And also, Royal Bengal Tiger called and said that you could have some of his attention.
Great.
Okay. On to the questions. We have a lot of questions. Gina Douglas would like to know, do you use seeds gathered from the wild or other propagation methods to multiply the plants you reintroduce?
So yes, is the answer. So reintroductions are done, as I say, in line with those IUCN standards and guidelines. So I will consider things like sampling for genetic diversity, sampling from the nearest population if possible. And I'll also look to limit impacts on vulnerable populations. So for one species that I spoke about, the great sundew, there's only a couple of populations left in the Northwest, and they're in Cumbria. And the populations tend to be quite small. So what I did there when I got consent to sample is I didn't remove any plants. I just cut leaves from the very odd plant and took leaf cuttings. So the answer to that, simple answer, is yes.
Okay. Alex would like to know what is being done for lady slipper orchid in Lancashire?
Well, it was reintroduced, I think, in collaboration with Kew Gardens. I don't really know about anything else that's sort of being planned there, to be honest. So yeah, I think the reintroduction's being done and they're just being monitored as far as I know. Yeah.
Okay. Victoria Burton, which other habitats do you think should be a priority for plant? I'm sorry, just one second.
Sorry.
Which other habitats do you think should be a priority for plant reintroduction or reinforcement, either in the Northwest or the UK as a whole?
I think grasslands are definitely low down on the list for some reason, for the government and even for some conservation organisations. And we've lost an incredible number of our wildflower grasslands, or in particular our mesotrophic grasslands, our unimproved calcareous grasslands, and there are a lot of species associated with those really special old grasslands that have never been touched by agriculture, that grow nowhere else. A lot of them have problems with dispersal. So I touched upon Dyer's greenweed, a gorgeous plant in the pea family, that I'm hoping to re-establish to a few sites in the northwest soon. So Dyer's greenweed, it's a plant of very old and unimproved, so nutrient poor grasslands. And it has a real problem dispersing itself generally. Its seeds only remain fertile for under a year, and it relies on continuity of grassland. So if the grassland gets too rank, eventually it'll die out. If the grassland's overgrazed, it'll die out. So there are a lot of species associated with special grasslands that I think need a lot of help and might benefit from reintroduction programs, is the answer.
Right. There are three questions that relate to genetic diversity and reintroduction. So I'm just going to club all of them.
Okay.
So is the lesser bladderwort all one clone? And in general, the question is there any approach on how to deal with constraints posed by decreased genetic diversity in case of reintroduction when it's from a small population?
Yeah, so yes, that was actually a big consideration in the lesser bladderwort reintroduction. And there's another target species called marsh club moss, where genetic diversity was definitely looked into, and both of those species are really interesting. So the bladderworts as a whole in Britain don't tend to rely on sexual reproduction, actually. Most of them are really heavily reliant on asexual reproduction. So if a bird comes into a water body and gets a bit of a leaf or a bit of stem trapped in its feathers or on its feet, and transfers it to one place to another. And so the bladderworts don't actually rely an awful lot on sexual reproduction. There's a couple of species that don't even flower in Britain, and there's one species, common bladderwort, that doesn't set seed. It's sterile completely. And so the answer to that, I suppose, is I've most definitely considered genetic diversity there. And I think with lesser bladderwort, it's not too much of a problem because it's a plant that is heavily reliant on asexual reproduction. It's a plant that doesn't recruit very often, if at all. So yes.
Just an addendum to that, Ray Heaton has asked, in further reintroduction of the bladderwort, will you sample the original population in Cheshire, as this might have greater genetic diversity than your first plants?
The answer to that is no. So I sampled from across this little puddle, and the population's quite small. And so I don't think there would be, I mean, I've not done any tests, so I can't confirm that this would be the case, but I would highly suspect that additional sampling wouldn't add anything in terms of genetic diversity, and it also might just add that extra bit of risk to the very last native population left. So that's not something that's on the cards at the moment.
Okay.
Yeah.
Here's a question that I also had from Jenny. Does plants provide function? So what function it provides? For example, is it food plant to a certain invertebrate? How do you decide what to reintroduce?
Well, it's not so much, most of the time anyway, it's not so much about what specific species of plant might benefit. Most of the time, the considerations focus around securing the prospects of those individual plants, full stop. And also a big part of plant reintroduction that I sort of touched upon is not only can plant reintroductions act to secure the conservation status of individual species like the lesser bladderwort, which has actually been wiped out through most of England, but reintroductions can also go some way to restoring habitats. So the focus isn't generally upon what other things the plants can benefit. The focus is generally upon securing the prospect of those plant species without detriment to other species, and also helping to restore ecosystem functionality as a whole, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a more holistic view rather than a very utilitarian view of what a plant provides. Roger Heath would like to know, have you banked seed at the RBGQ Millennium Seed Bank?
I haven't, no. I should probably be ashamed of that. But no is the answer.
Okay. Nancy's asking, are there photos of these rare plants on your website? I'm guessing they can find them on your website, right?
Yeah, and on my Twitter, I post about them quite a lot on this, mostly on my personal Twitter, actually, but also at this sort of tag down here. So yeah.
Okay, great. Your lecture was so inspiring, and therefore this is a good question, is with long-term projects like plant reintroduction, consistent funding has been challenging or can be challenging. Do you have any tips for people looking for funding?
How many what, sorry? How many?
To get funding for reintroduction, or long-term funding rather.
Yeah, to be honest, so I was actually really lucky when I graduated from university. I volunteered quite a lot, and so I was awarded a scholarship in recognition of that, which is marvellous. And I was given £2,000, felt like a millionaire. And so actually, to begin with, I was just intent on funding it myself. And I was actually approached by Chester Zoo. I was really fortunate there. I was approached by Chester Zoo, who give a few £1,000s every year to help cover expenses and time. So for me personally, I've been really privileged, and it wasn't very difficult to get funding for me personally. So I suppose it depends what you want to do, and contact and all kinds of other things. I don't know. Yeah.
Are there any particularly charismatic plant species which you would like to work with but haven't had the chance?
All of them. They're all charismatic. I love them. I don't. Probably something like fringe gentian might be certainly something I would love to cultivate, but it's extinct in Britain now, so that's not an option. Yeah, that might be one.
Okay. Here's a general question, but I think a question a lot of us might have. As somebody who's enthusiastic about plants, what can we do to get more involved in plant conservation efforts?
Well, there's loads of things that people could do. The first thing that I always tell people who want to help is vote with your wallet and donate to local conservation groups. The wildlife trusts are probably some of the best when it comes to plant conservation. Then there's Plant Life and the BSBI, who not so involved in conservation, but big on education and science. And one thing that I've found helped me a lot was actually to grow a lot of plants that I might have purchased off the internet and not dug up from the wild. So I grow a lot of plants just for my own interest and enjoyment. And yeah, if that's an okay answer.
Yeah, sure. Rishabh Chaudhary asked, does the UK government have any kind of catalogue about reintroduced species? Is there somewhere anyone can look up?
No, but with the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland just keeping it to plants, they tend to have notes associated with records to say whether a species record is from an introduced or a reintroduced population a lot of the
Okay.
time. So there are things like that. Yeah.
Okay, I see. Aoife Boyd asks, do you protect the plants when you transplant them, for example, from trampling or eaten by rabbits?
Yes. So sometimes I'll put cages over things initially, just while things get established. Other times I could just put like a marker beside them so people who walk on reserves know to avoid certain things. So yes, is the answer.
Okay. And what caused the decline in the plants which you now have success with, or what has changed regarding the habitat?
Lots of things, lots of factors. Primary driver of plant extinctions has been agricultural intensification, both historically and recently. Things like development and peat extraction with peatlands have been more recent problems as well. But primarily it's one of the primary drivers, certainly, of plant declines and extinctions is agricultural intensification, particularly when it comes to the application of things like artificial nitrogen-based fertilizers, which have caused an immense amount of damage and I think should be banned. But yes.
Yeah.
Mm.
Any tips for trying to learn plant identification? People find it difficult to make it stick in their brains.
Oh, well, I always used to read, there's a Collins photographic guide, which is gorgeous. It's got loads of gorgeous pictures. And I just used to read through it and correlate the names to the pictures. But there are loads of apps like iNaturalist that you can use and take pictures of plants and it'll give you suggestions of what it might be. So yeah, there's a few things.
Yeah, I think taking photos as well as making your own sketches can make them stick in your head, just like
Mm.
old school nature journaling, field diaries, that kind of thing
Yeah.
often helps. Elizabeth Rawlinson asks, do you think that the restrictions on picking plants in the wild inhibit potential interest from children as they can only look even with common species and not really handle them? Or is that?
Well, I think that people can admire plants without picking them, firstly. But yeah, it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because you might have a child who picks a flower and it's a really rare, I don't know, a dark helleborine orchid. But then again, it might just be a daisy. So I suppose it depends where they're picking flowers and what they're picking. But generally, I don't like the thought of picking flowers just for your own enjoyment and then you're depriving something else of that
Yeah.
resource, if you like. Yeah.
Yeah, true. I'm afraid I have to cut it off here
That's all
because
right.
we can go on and questions will keep coming. But just to let everybody know, if your question has not been answered here, Joshua is very active on Twitter. And would you like to say your Twitter ID here?
Yeah, sure. So it's I'm Joshua Styles, or at Joshua the letter L for Lima 951.
Right.
So yeah.
Thank you so much, Joshua.
That's all
And
right.
see
Thank
you some
you.
other. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
All right. See you later. Bye. Bye.